Please let me know where you are viewing from and what time you are listening to this narration in the comments section. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. There is a documented case that has baffled historians for almost 2 centuries in the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to valleys that appear to have been abandoned by time. The Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, each 9 years old, arrived in the distant Pine Hollow Baptist Church in 1834. The community was so remote that it was hardly noted on maps of the time. The events of their 3-day stay were scrupulously documented in Pastor William Phillips' personal notebook, which was found in 1987 when the old church was eventually dismantled. Modern psychologists have studied the journal entries in great detail because they describe experiences that are so exact and remarkably accurate. How 2 young toddlers could have information that contradicted all reasonable explanations, however, is beyond comprehension. In addition to making predictions about the future, the Morrison twins also detailed people they had never met, disclosed secrets that had been kept for decades, and discussed catastrophes that had happened years before they were born. Perhaps most disturbing of all, though, was that every single detail they disclosed turned out to be completely, verifiably accurate. Only those who have the courage to tackle puzzles that contradict our conception of reality itself should watch this channel. Be careful to subscribe before we delve further into the Morrison case, as we will be revealing information that most historians would rather not talk about. Additionally, let us know in the comments which state you are listening from, as the events in Kentucky may have occurred closer to you than you may have thought. The notion that certain human minds can access information in ways that science is still unable to understand is the story's starting point, rather than the supernatural. Communities like Pine Hollow lived in near seclusion among the foothills of the Cumberland in 1834, a region torn between wilderness and civilization. 3 families had founded this specific community in 1,818 inches order to escape the denominational strife that afflicted larger cities and to pursue religious freedom. There were only 200 people living in Pine Hollow by the time the Morrison family arrived, most of them linked by blood or marriage, and they were all subject to the rigid Baptist ideology that governed every part of their daily life. The community's focal point was a little wooden church that they had constructed themselves out of wood from the nearby hills. The sole written records of births, funerals, marriages, and important occurrences were kept by Pastor William Phillips, a scholarly man who had left his luxurious life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls. His attention to detail would be essential in recording what was going to happen. A familiar name on the tour of isolated churches dotted over the Appalachian region was Ezekiel Morrison. He journeyed on foot with his children, carrying only a battered leather satchel that held his Bible, a few personal belongings, and the journal in which he documented his spiritual observations. He was tall and rugged, with prematurely gray hair that told of struggles beyond his 34 years. Since his wife Sarah had away while giving birth to the twins during a horrific winter storm that cut off their cabin for weeks, he had been a widower for 9 years. Although Rebecca and Rachel were strikingly alike in appearance, their temperaments couldn't be more opposite. Born minutes ahead of schedule, Rebecca had an extroverted personality that attracted people to her right away. She spoke with the assurance of someone much older, and her laughter was sincere and her smile contagious. Quieter and more perceptive, Rachel appeared to live in her sister's shadow. However, those who paid careful attention saw that she frequently started sentences that Rebecca would finish, or responded to inquiries about her sister before Rebecca could finish. Ezekiel's reputation for restoring spiritual life to troubled congregations was what set the Morrison family apart among the preachers on the circuit. Tales of backsliders regaining their faith, of communities settling long-standing disputes, and of spiritual awakenings that persisted for years after their departure were among the stories that followed them from church to church. Some ascribed this to Ezekiel's impassioned sermons, but more astute observers saw that the genuine transformations frequently started following private discussions with the twins. The trip to Pine Hollow had been especially challenging. The mountain trails had become dangerous muck due to late autumn rains, and Rachel had been ill with a fever, forcing Ezekiel to carry her the last 5 miles. On the 15th of November, 1834, they arrived at dusk. right as Pastor Phillips was wrapping up evening prayers with the small group of weekday churchgoers. Phillips subsequently said that his initial impression of the family was one of extreme physical and spiritual exhaustion. Ezekiel's boots were worn thin from walking the mountains for miles, and his clothing was patched and tattered. Rachel was still pale from her fever, and Rebecca's customary brightness had muted due to tiredness as the girls clutched to their father. However, Phillips felt strangely nervous because of something in their eyes, an awareness, an alertness that didn't seem natural for kids their age. The Pine Hollow congregation had hosted other itinerant preachers over the years, but the Morrisons stood out from the start. Rebecca inquired about the pastor's wife's garden that first night while the family was having a casual dinner with the Phillips family. She wanted to know if the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that had almost killed them 3 summers prior. Mrs. Phillips was looking at the child in wonder after dropping her spoon. Although her beloved flower garden had been destroyed by rose blight 3 years before, she had not told anybody about it outside of her small neighborhood. Rebecca just grinned and stated that she had dreamed about roses while out for a stroll and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips cultivated the most exquisite ones in the country when she was pressured. This event, which was noted in Pastor Phillips' journal that same evening, would turn out to be just the first of many that would call into question the Pine Hollow community's entire conception of nature. The following morning was gloomy and chilly, with a sour wind rattling the windows of the tiny cottage where the Morrison family had taken refuge. As usual, Pastor Phillips got up early to get ready for the sermon that day. He discovered Ezekiel already awake, sitting by the fire's dwindling embers with his Bible open and his gaze fixed on the horizon with a worried face. Ezekiel responded, "The girls had disturbing dreams last night." When Phillips asked him about his tumultuous mood, "They often dream of the places we're going to visit, but these dreams were different, darker." Rebecca emerged in the doorway before Phillips could reply, her eyes focused and awake, her hair unkempt from sleep. The pastor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her childish, clear voice, "there's something hidden in your church, beneath a 3rd floorboard from the altar, that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed about why it's hidden. Under those very floorboards, he had truly concealed a bottle of alcohol, which stood in for his continuous battle with temptation. Nobody was aware of it. 3 months before, he had put it there in a moment of weakness, telling himself that it was better to keep it around so he could fight it every day than to completely eliminate the temptation. He had only told God about it in his private prayers, and it was a secret that greatly embarrassed him. With his voice hardly steady, Phillips questioned, "What exactly did you dream, child?" Moving with that strange, silent grace that seemed to pervade everything she did, Rachel stepped out of the shadows behind her sister. Phillips dropped into his chair as though his legs were giving him. "The bottle is brown," she murmured gently, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket. A blue blanket. The material was, in fact, a piece of a baby blanket that had belonged to the kid he and his wife had lost 5 years prior when he was still a baby. As a reminder of his shortcomings as a preacher who was unable to overcome his own shortcomings, and as a father who was unable to save his child, he had wrapped the bottle in it." Ezekiel saw his host's response with a look that was a mixture of pity and tired familiarity. "It started when they were very young," he said in a low voice. "At first I thought it was merely childish intuition, the way young ones sometimes sense things adults miss. But as they grew older, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain through natural means. Everyone in the Pine Hollow Church would remember that Sunday service for the rest of their lives." Ezekiel's sermon was a strong call for spiritual regeneration and sin confession, which is not out of the ordinary for a circuit preacher. What followed was inexplicable from any logical standpoint. Rebecca went over to Samuel Turner, a successful farmer who was well known in the neighborhood and for his donations to the church, as the congregation started to file out. "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't really stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says, God forgives those who repent," she remarked, gazing up at him with her naive blue eyes. Turner's face lost its color. He had been collecting little sums from the collection plate for 6 months in order to pay off debts from a failed business endeavor in Louisville. The missing money had been gnawing at his conscience like a disease, but he had promised himself that whenever his financial circumstances changed, he would restore every penny. Rachel stood next to her sister before Turner could reply, and she spoke to Martha Whitfield, the old widow who was the unofficial moral head of the church. The old woman staggered as though she may pass out. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband didn't die in the farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere." "And that's why you hide the letters." 15 years prior, her husband had really deserted her and their kids, stealing their savings and going missing one night without warning. To protect her honor and the future of her children in the community, she had made up the tale of his unintentional death. The letters Rachel referred to were the sporadic letters she got from him, explaining his new life in Missouri and begging for forgiveness. She had never told anyone about them. The twins made their way through the congregation one by one, whispering to different people. They brought up people who had passed away while under Dr. Hayes's care because he lacked the necessary medical knowledge. The Millers talked knowingly to their neighbors about their son, a young man whose simple-mindedness embarrassed them. They kept him concealed in their attic. They told young Thomas Brett about his private encounters with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband was always on the road for work. As though the girls were merely exchanging weather observations, each disclosure was given with a childish innocence, free from bias or malice. However, their words were so accurate, so impossible, that the assembly remained motionless in amazement and dread. Pastor Phillips was appalled and fascinated when 2 9-year-old youngsters turned his orderly society upside down by sharing secrets that only God should have known. However, Rebecca's last words would follow him around for the rest of his life. She made her way to the front of the church, stood in front of the altar, and laid her little hand on the wooden cross that the church's founders had carved. "But it's been tarnished by what happened here before. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here, in this very room, and some of you know exactly why." She continued, her voice echoing clearly through the quiet sanctuary. The ensuing hush was deafening, as if nature itself was waiting for someone to answer this preposterous charge. The congregation was hit like a physical blow when the Whitman family's secret was revealed. With a face as pale as morning frost, Pastor Phillips clutched the pulpit until his knuckles turned white. Despite 16 years of communal silence, the Whitman tragedy remained Pine Hollow's darkest secret, a scar that had never fully healed. The Whitman family had been one of the most well-known residents of Pine Hollow in 1818, when it was still a thriving community of only 50 people. While his wife Mary was well known for her ability to use herbal medicines and her patient approach to difficult births, Jacob Whitman was a blacksmith and unofficial leader. As 9-year-old twins, Hope and Faith had been the community's darlings. They assisted their mother in caring for the ill and sang in the church choir. According to the official narrative, which was documented in the meticulously preserved documents of Pastor Phillips's predecessor, the Whitman family had died in a terrible house fire that occurred during a winter storm. They were buried in the church cemetery with the proper rites when their bodies were discovered among the remnants of their house. As was required of frontier towns when tragedy struck, the community grieved, rebuilt, and moved on. However, Rebecca's statement implied a very different reality, one that many of the more senior members of the congregation had hoped would never be revealed. One of the founding families of Pine Hollow, Elder Thompson, now 73, rose slowly from his pew. When he finally spoke, his voice bore the weight of decades, yet his arthritis made movement difficult. Rebecca turned to face him, her blue eyes displaying an unnerving maturity. "Child," he continued, his words measured and deliberate, "you speak of things that happened before you were born, in places you've never been. How could you possibly know about what you claim to know?" "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she muttered. The older members of the congregation murmured in recognition. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll that their father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress, and Hope was in her nightgown. because she had been ill with fever. The wife of Elder Thompson gripped his arm, her eyes wide with terror and realization. The church had become so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed abnormally loud. "The night they died," Rachel went on, in a quiet but clear voice, "it wasn't a house fire that killed them. They came to the church seeking sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found anyway." Pastor Phillips discovered that he was recalling bits and pieces of conversations he had overheard. When he stepped into a room, the whispered words ceased. When specific themes were up, the senior members exchanged meaningful looks. The manner in which certain families consistently placed flowers at an unmarked graveyard location. Still reeling from the earlier disclosure of his financial wrongdoings, Samuel Turner rose suddenly to his feet. He said, "This is madness," but his voice lacked conviction. Other information started to come out of the assembly while he was saying, "These children are speaking nonsense, making up stories to frighten us. There's no way they could know such things." Elizabeth's mother-in-law, Mrs. Carter, muttered something about bloodstains that had developed on the church floor years later and that were impossible to remove despite intense cleaning. Old Benjamin Foster talked of the odd noises that occasionally came from the church in the middle of the night. They sounded like children's cries and were written off as wind coming through the loose boards. Even though he had previously felt embarrassed by his medical background, Dr. Hayes now found himself speaking with clinical accuracy. Slowly, he murmured, "I've always wondered about the church's foundation." The ramifications of his statement lingered in the air. "When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like, well, what could have been bone fragments mixed with the original mortar. Every service, prayer, and moment of devotion would have been held over the unmarked graves of the Whitman family if they had indeed passed away inside the church and their bodies had been hidden inside its walls." Throughout these discoveries, Ezekiel Morrison had stood quietly, his weathered face displaying profound worry, but not astonishment. He had seen similar scenarios in other places, where his daughter's unfathomable knowledge exposed long-buried realities and dispelled meticulously cultivated lies. Ezekiel sat silent for a long time, observing the faces of the crowd before answering. "Mr. Morrison," began Pastor Phillips in a strained voice, "how do your daughters know these things? What manner of gift allows them such insight?" When he eventually said, "I've asked myself that question every day for years," their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to sense things beyond normal perception. But what the girls experience goes far beyond anything Sarah ever demonstrated. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people they've never met, know details about events that occurred before their birth. He stopped and looked at his daughters with a combination of affection and profound sorrow. "At first I believed it was a blessing, a divine gift that would help me minister to troubled souls. But over the years, I've begun to wonder if it's something else entirely. The knowledge they possess. It comes with a cost. They carry the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's pain. They know things children should never have to know." The twins stood together in the front of the church, as though called by their father's words. They appeared to be children for the first time since they had arrived, frail, little, and overpowered by the adult world that surrounded them. Rebecca spoke the words, "We don't choose what we see," with a tiredness that seemed much too mature for her youthful appearance. Rachel nodded, her hand touching her sister's. "The dreams come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, and sometimes, what will be. The Whitman sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They want people to know what really happened to them. They want someone to remember them properly." The church became silent once more, but this time it was because individuals were struggling with ideas that contradicted their basic conception of reality. Some faces displayed doubt, some dread, and some a growing optimism that maybe death was not the end they had always thought it would be. At a turning point that would shape the remainder of his ministry, Pastor Phillips found himself. The community's carefully cultivated stability could be preserved if he rejected the twins' statements as either willful lie or childlike imagination. Or he might risk uprooting the foundations that Pine Hollow had been built on and follow the truth wherever it led. None of them could have predicted the unexpected implications of the choice. That night, as the shadows grew longer over Pine Hollow's winding lanes, Pastor Phillips could not focus on his nightly prayers. He had been deeply rattled by the twins' confessions, not just because they were true, but also because they made him face issues he had been ignoring for years. Eager to serve God in the wilderness, and to get away from the ideological disputes that beset the more established churches in Kentucky's major towns, he had come to Pine Hollow 5 years prior. Although his predecessor, Pastor Moriah Hayes, had meticulously documented births, deaths, and important events, Phillips had consistently observed holes in the early settlement's record-keeping. Particularly the winter of 1818 seemed strangely devoid of documented information. The tragedy of the Whitman family was mentioned only in passing in the entries about severe weather, shortages of supplies, and the deaths of several elderly residents, Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters Hope and Faith, perished in a house fire on the night of December 21st. Their earthly remains were committed to the ground with appropriate Christian ceremony. Phillips had always found it odd that such a significant event was not covered in detail. Even small occurrences had been meticulously documented by Pastor Hayes, but the loss of a whole family, especially one as well known as the Whitmans, had been reported with uncommon brevity. Phillips started looking through the church's archived documents with fresh eyes, determined to learn what the Morrison twins might have discovered. He found a little leather diary he had never seen before, buried behind years' worth of accumulated documents. The handwriting was unmistakably Pastor Hayes's, despite the pages being brittle and ruined by water. Phillips' perspective on Pine Hollow's past would be permanently altered by what he read that evening by candlelight. According to the journal, the circumstances surrounding the death of the Whitman family had caused Pastor Hayes much distress. Jacob Whitman's private notes reveal that he had found something troubling about some of the community's members, something so important that he had called for a public apology and apology. Although the discovery's nature was not made explicit, Hayes's entries implied that it entailed financial malfeasance and perhaps even more serious issues. Jacob Whitman reportedly engaged in a heated conference with a number of local authorities on the evening of the 20th of December 1818 that lasted until after midnight. Hayes described threats of discovery, charges of corruption and embezzlement, and raised voices that would ruin the reputations of some of Pine Hollow's most prestigious families. The final note, dated December 22nd, was especially chilling. "The Lord forgive us all for what was done. Jacob and his family came to the church seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul." Phillips's hands were shaking as he put the journal down. The ramifications were astounding. The Whitmans had not perished in a home fire. The leaders of the community had plotted to conceal the fact that they had been killed inside the church. However, how could the Morrison twins have known information that had been kept secret for 16 years? How could they be so accurate in describing the kids' attire, personal items, and physical attributes? A gentle knock on his door broke the silence of his reflection. He opened it to see Rebecca standing in the moonlight, still in her plain dress, but with her hair pulled back in a perfect braid, as though she had been up all night getting ready for something significant. Phillips looked at her in awe. "Pastor Phillips," she began in a clear, childlike voice, "you found Pastor Hayes's journal, didn't you? The one he hid behind the loose stone in the foundation. In fact, he had located the journal there, following a faint outline that had led him to the loose stone." "How did you know where to tell me to look?" wondered the man. "Faith showed me in a dream," Rebecca said sarcastically. Phillips felt cold as she casually mentioned getting advice from a long-dead child. She said Pastor Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She wanted someone to know the truth. "Rebecca," he began cautiously, "what exactly do you see when you have these dreams?" The child's face darkened, and Phillips briefly saw the weight on her shoulders. "Simply put, we see everything," she stated. He could see Rachel sitting by the window, gazing out at the church cemetery. But Rebecca looked past him into the cabin and asked, what had he discovered? Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Whitman family didn't plan to hurt anyone. They just wanted Jacob to stay quiet about what he'd discovered. The money for the church building didn't come from donations, she stated. Some of it was stolen from travelers passing through the valley. Jacob found out about it when he was asked to make horseshoes for horses that belonged to dead men. Philip's mind started to put the pieces together. Reports of tourists going missing along the mountain pathways had been common in Pine Hollow's early years. Officially, bears, falls, and exposure to severe weather were blamed for these disappearances. However, if Jacob Whitman had found proof that some travelers had been robbed and killed on purpose, Rebecca went on. The church was built with blood money, her youthful voice bearing an awareness that shouldn't have been conceivable for someone her age. That's why faith and hope can't rest. Their blood was spilled on ground that was already cursed. Phillips was confronted with a reality more terrible than he could have ever dreamed. The sanctuary where he had prayed for comfort and direction, the church he had dedicated his life to serving, had been built with the money from murder and had now become the scene of even more horrific acts of violence. However, a part of his mind continued to be analytical as he struggled with these insights, asking how he could confirm any of this. How could he tell the difference between a complex lie and divine knowledge? The response would arrive sooner than he anticipated, and it would come from a source that would refute any logical justification he could have come up with. An unexpected guest arrived in Pine Hollow the following morning. A lone horseman rode up the eastern trail to the village as the Morrison family was getting ready to leave, their 3-day stay already extended to meet Sunday's startling discovery. The rider, a man in his 50s, was well dressed in the style of the town's residents and had an air of authority and education. He identified himself to Pastor Phillips as Thomas Brennan, a Lexington-based solicitor who has been looking for information on Pine Hollow's history since its inception. Brennan said, "I represent the estate of one Marcus Webb," as he accepted Phillips' invitation. "Mr. Webb died recently in Louisville, and among his effects we found documents suggesting he had business dealings with this community in its early years. I'm attempting to trace the disposition of certain funds that may have been irregularly transferred." Phillips experienced a chill in his veins. One among the travelers who vanished along the mountain roads in 1818 and 1819 was Marcus Webb, whose name had surfaced in Pastor Hayes's covert journal. Hayes's notes indicate that Webb had been carrying a sizable amount of cash meant for Tennessee land transactions. With that strange timing that marked so many of her appearances, Rebecca was at Phillips's elbow before he could come up with a reply. She replied, "Mr. Webb had a gold watch with his initials engraved inside the cover. It had a crack across the crystal because he dropped it when he fell from his horse." Brennan's calmness clearly broke as she raised her inquiring gaze to him. "How could you possibly know about Marcus Webb's watch?" he asked. Rachel appeared next to her sister as though called by an unseen signal. That detail was mentioned only in his personal correspondence with his brother. Silently, she stated, "The watch is buried behind the church, along with his money bag and his horse's bridle. Elder Thompson put them there after what happened on the trail." Phillips felt the implications, as if they were a bodily blow. If the twins were right, and Marcus Webb's personal belongings were actually interred behind the church, it would demonstrate that their knowledge was considerably more extensive than that of any typical child. More significantly, it would offer concrete proof of the crimes that had financed the initial construction of Pine Hollow. With urgency, Brennan got off his horse. "I demand that we excavate the area immediately," stated the speaker. "If what these children claim is true, we're looking at evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Thompson, who had been watching the conversation from afar, reluctantly stepped forward. He was 73 years old and the only person still alive from the original leadership group that had made the decisions back then. There was a mix of defiance and resignation on his wrinkled face. Thompson's voice carried the weight of his age and position as he continued, "You speak of things you don't understand, stranger. This community was built by God-fearing people who did what they had to do to survive in the wilderness. Survival doesn't justify murder," Brennan responded with force. If these allegations are true, this entire settlement was founded on criminal acts. Rebecca's eerie blue eyes, which appeared to see too much, were fixed on Elder Thompson. Thompson's facade clearly broke down when she asked softly, "Mr. Thompson, the nightmares stopped coming after the first year, didn't they? You told yourself that meant God had forgiven you." The old man sank onto a nearby tree stump, as if his legs were failing him. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't know about. No one knows about the dreams where Marcus Webb begged you to let him go," Rachel added, her gentle voice echoing clearly in the morning air. "About how you see his face every night before you fall asleep." He broke off. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said. His admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "We only meant to take the money. We were starving, our children were sick, and winter was coming." But Webb fought back, and then Pastor Phillips became aware that everything he had held dear about his church, his community, and his faith was coming apart. After remaining mute during these revelations, Ezekiel Morrison eventually spoke. "Silently, the truth has a way of surfacing," he whispered. Brennan quickly organized an excavation party, saying, "My daughters don't choose what they reveal. They're simply conduits for information that demands to be heard." Following the twins' exact instructions, a number of local guys dug behind the church in a matter of hours. As each shovelful of dirt took them closer to proof that might shatter Pine Hollow's meticulously crafted mythology, Pastor Phillips stared with increasing fear. They didn't need to delve very far. Their shovels struck a metallic object 3 feet below the surface. A tarnished gold pocket watch was discovered when they carefully brushed away the dirt. Yes, as Rebecca had said, its crystal was fractured. Inside the cover, the initials MW were easily readable. There was a leather money bag next to the watch. Its contents had long since degraded, but it was there. Despite being rotten after years of burial, the horse's bridle was still identifiable as what it had been. With the painstaking precision of a man used to constructing legal arguments, Brennan scrutinized every item. "This watch matches the description in Marcus Webb's correspondence exactly," he said. The most incriminating proof, however, came from Elder Thompson's response. The crack across the crystal, the engraving, even the unusual chain link. Everything is precisely as his brother described it. The elderly man's lips moved in what may have been prayer or confession as he gazed at the discovered objects with the look of someone seeing ghosts. He finally added, "There were others," in a voice that was almost audible. "Webb wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last." The trail through these mountains was perfect for what we needed to do. Travelers came through regularly, usually alone, often carrying money for land deals or business ventures. The extent of the atrocities was coming into focus. Hard work and divine providence have not created Pine Hollow. It had been funded over the course of years by a methodical campaign of murder and thievery. However, as the evidence grew, Phillips was still faced with issues that went beyond the specific crimes. How did the Morrison twins have knowledge of information that no live person should have? How could they explain crimes that had happened before they were born, victims they had never met, or the locations of evidence that had been kept secret for decades? He would be forced to face the notion that death was not the conclusion he had always thought it was, and the answers would prove more unsettling than any logical explanation he could have come up with. Phillips became aware that his town was at a turning point when the sun descended over Pine Hollow that evening, illuminating the dig site and the church graveyard beyond with long shadows. After 16 years of meticulous concealment, the truth was finally coming to light. Questions that called into doubt everything they had been taught to believe about justice, salvation, and the nature of reality itself, however, came along with it. With their diminutive forms silhouetted against the chapel that had been constructed with blood money and dedicated with innocent blood, the Morrison twins stood together in the encroaching darkness. With their faces turned toward the cemetery, where so many secrets were hidden beneath unmarked graves, they appeared to be listening to something that only they could hear. Tonight belonged to the dead, who had at last found their voices through 2 9-year-old children who had knowledge that defied all reasonable explanations, but tomorrow would come reckoning. A group of officials from the county seat arrived as dawn broke over Pine Hollow, gloomy and cold. News of what had been found the day before had spread quickly, and Solicitor Brennan had not wasted any time in calling the police. By mid-morning, a territory judge, a county sheriff, and 2 federal marshals who had spent years looking into the disappearances of tourists along the mountain paths had arrived in the tiny community. Given the church's blood-stained past, Pastor Phillips thought it cruelly appropriate that Judge Harrison, a severe man with silver hair and piercing gray eyes, had set up his temporary court there. Everyone in the neighborhood had been called to what would be a hearing and a reckoning. Sitting in the front pew with 2 other senior men who had been on the initial leadership council, Elder Thompson's health was clearly suffering as a result of his confessions. The hollow look of men who had held horrible secrets for too long was seen on their features. The Morrison Twins, however, were the center of attention. Judge Harrison had been dubious about the claims that 2 children had supernatural knowledge, but what he had learned the day before had made him change his mind. He had interviewed each of them separately throughout the morning, attempting to ascertain how they could possibly be aware of specifics of crimes that had occurred before they were even born. Judge Harrison's voice reverberated in the wooden church as he shouted, "Rebecca Morrison, please tell this court exactly how you know the location of Marcus Webb's personal effects." Rebecca stood in the witness area, looking so tiny under the pressure of adult scrutiny. "Faith Whitman told me in a dream," she added plainly. "She said the men who killed her family were the same ones who killed the travelers. She wanted everyone to know the truth." The judge said, "And you, Rachel Morrison?" Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair as Rachel answered, her voice barely audible. "How do you know details about events that occurred years before your birth? The dreams come to both of us. We see what happened as if we were there. We see the fear in people's eyes. We hear their last words. We feel their pain." Ezekiel Morrison got up from his chair and asked, "Are you claiming to communicate with the spirits of the dead?" "Your Honor, if I may, my daughters have never claimed to understand their abilities. They simply report what they experience. I've witnessed them provide accurate information about dozens of communities we visited, information they couldn't possibly have obtained through normal means." The twins were spoken to directly by Sheriff Mackenzie, a pragmatic man who was more interested in the facts than in paranormal assertions. Rachel and Rebecca exchanged a profound look before Rebecca responded. "Can you tell us how many people were killed along these mountain trails?" The specificity of their response caused muttering among the gathered throng. 11 men over 3 years. Most were traveling alone with money for land purchases or business ventures. One was a preacher like Papa, but he carried gold coins sewn into his saddle. As unnerving as ever, Rachel's tag team delivery carried on where her sister had left off. Sheriff Mackenzie looked at a battered notebook he had taken from his coat and read. The preacher's name was Samuel Collins. He was going to establish a new church in Tennessee. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on her forehead. As he located the entry he sought, his face turned pale. Samuel Collins disappeared along this route in September of 1819. He said, "The description of his horse matches our records exactly." However, what followed would rock everyone in attendance to their core. Elder Thompson stumbled to his feet, his hands shaking with age and remorse. The church fell silent, save for the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the sound of wind through the loose boards. "Your Honor," he said, his voice breaking, "I can bear this burden no longer. What these children say is true, every word of it. But there's something else, something worse than the murders we committed." The Whitman family, Thompson added, tears running down his weathered cheeks, didn't just stumble upon evidence of our crimes. Jacob Whitman was my brother-in-law. I confided in him about what we were doing, thinking that family loyalty would keep him quiet. But Jacob had a conscience stronger than his loyalty. If we didn't make amends to the families of the deceased, Jacob threatened to expose us all. He promised to travel himself to Lexington and inform the territorial authorities of our transgressions. We couldn't allow that to occur. Thompson's voice trailed off to a whisper. "We followed the Whitman family to the church on the evening of the 21st of December, 1818, because too many families relied on what we had established here. In the belief that the Holy Land would keep them safe, Jacob had brought Mary and the babies here. However, we were desperate men who stood to lose everything. "Tell them about the babies," Rebecca murmured gently, her youthful face growing pale but determined as she remained motionless during Thompson's confession. "Dear God," he wept, "how could you know about the babies?" Harrison leaned forward and said, "Judge, what babies? Man, give an explanation." "Mary Whitman had a child while we—" Thompson's words seemed to fall out of his throat as he stated, 8 months along with twins when we killed her. According to the doctor, they could have survived if— "That's why we can see everything so clearly," Rachel said, her gentle voice echoing through the astonished quiet as he was unable to finish the statement. "If we had gotten help instead of—" It was not just Faith and Hope Whitman who perished that night. They died with their unborn sisters. Justice is demanded by 4 souls. Rachel's statement shocked the gathered crowd with its theological implications. If the twins were somehow channeling the spirits of the dead Whitman children, including the unborn, it suggested an understanding of the afterlife that went against basic Christian doctrine. Dr. Hayes, the unofficial physician of the community, found his voice and said slowly, "I assisted with the burial. We found every soul matters to God." Ezekiel Morrison asserted resolutely, "And every life, no matter how brief, has eternal significance." We discovered evidence of the pregnancy, but we convinced ourselves that the kids had been too immature to have souls and would not require proper burial privileges. Judge Harrison, however, was more interested in practical justice than in spiritual discussion. "You're admitting to killing Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, their twin daughters, and 2 unborn children, Thompson?" "I am," Thompson said, in a dejectedly hollow voice, "and to the killings of 11 travelers who put their lives in our hands. All of us are at fault. Marcus Perry, Samuel Bradford, and myself. Together, we made the plan." The 2 other older men mentioned in Thompson's confession sat in stunned silence, their expressions masking dread and resignation, the weight of 16 years of collective guilt suddenly too great to bear. "We carried it out together, and we've hidden it together for 16 years. Before we proceed with formal charges," Judge Harrison said, "I need to understand how these children could possibly know details that were never recorded, never spoken of, never shared outside the circle of perpetrators." Rebecca looked up at the judge with those unnaturally knowing blue eyes. "Your Honor," she said, in her clear, childish voice, "some truths are too big to stay buried forever." Sheriff Mackenzie moved to place the 3 men under arrest, but Judge Harrison stopped him with a raised hand. "How do you hear them? The Whitman sisters and their unborn children have been waiting for someone to hear their story for 16 years. What mechanism permits this communication?" asked Judge Harrison. "We don't understand it any more than you do," Rachel remarked candidly as she joined her sister at the front of the church. "Since we were very young, we've had dreams about places we've never been and people we've never met. While Papa claims that our mother possessed the ability of second sight, our experiences are different." "Different how?" "Mama could sense things about living people, their emotions, their intentions, their hidden thoughts," Rebecca said after exchanging a deep look with Rachel. "However, we see past that. We witness the after effects of tragedy, particularly when innocent people are killed." "Your Honor," Ezekiel Morrison said, "I've spent years trying to understand my daughter's abilities." Morrison had been listening to his daughters with increasing alarm. "In Kentucky and Tennessee, I have conferred with academics, physicians, and preachers." Judge Harrison remained silent for a while, examining the twins with a mix of interest and anxiety. "Miss Rebecca, Miss Rachel," he said at last, "if you really have this gift, then maybe you can tell us where the bodies of the other victims were disposed of. No one can explain it, but everyone has seen its accuracy." "Some are in the old mine shaft east of town," Rebecca said after a moment, "and others were thrown into Devil's Creek, where the current runs deepest." The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implication. If the twins could find the remains of Marcus Webb and the other murdered travelers, It would provide the final proof needed to close cases that had perplexed authorities for years. However, the bones of 3 were interred with the foundation stones beneath the church floor. Pastor Phillips realized with horror that he had been conducting services, celebrating communion, and praying for salvation while standing directly over the unmarked graves of innocent men. The congregation shuddered when they learned that 3 murder victims had been buried beneath the church itself. Sheriff Mackenzie turned to Judge Harrison for guidance, saying, "Your Honor, if we're to verify these claims, we'll need to excavate the church floor itself." "And we will," Judge Harrison said grimly. "But first, I want to understand the full scope of these crimes." He turned back to Elder Thompson. "What happened to their belongings?" "Everything went into building our community," Thompson said, pointing feebly to the nearby church. "The mills, the church, the school. Blood money was used to build it all. We assured ourselves that if we utilized the money for good deeds, God would pardon us, since we were turning evil into something good." "And the relatives of the victims? Has anyone thought about the wives, kids, and parents who never found out what happened to their loved ones?" Judge Harrison inquired. With a youthful tone that seemed out of character for her age, Rachel responded, "Marcus Webb had 2 small sons and a wife named Elizabeth. Catherine, the Lady Samuel Collins was betrothed to, waited for him till she passed away 3 years later from using alcohol." The twins spoke of the murdered men as if they had known them personally, as if they carried the weight of their unmet expectations and neglected responsibilities. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the whole experience was the specificity of her knowledge about the victims' personal lives. These weren't just names and dates. The majority of the others had families who spent years wondering, hoping, and grieving without closure. "This court will recess while we conduct a thorough investigation of the claims made here today," Judge Harrison said as he got up to address the gathered crowd. "The search of the areas the Morrison children have identified and the excavation of the church floor will be coordinated by Sheriff Mackenzie." The congregation started to disperse in stunned silence as the 3 elderly men were led away in shackles. 16 years of meticulously maintained lies had come crashing down in one morning, leaving a community to face the realization that their entire foundation was based on murder and deceit. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will remain in custody pending formal charges. The Morrison twins stood together in the emptying church, their diminutive figures dwarfed by the magnitude of what they had revealed, and they appeared exhausted, drained by the emotional weight of channeling so much pain and injustice. However, Pastor Phillips still had the most troubling questions unanswered. How could 2 9-year-old children possess knowledge that defied every natural law? What did their abilities suggest about the nature of death, the persistence of consciousness, and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead? "Papa," Rebecca said quietly, "can we leave now?" Ezekiel Morrison held his daughters close, his weathered face displaying profound worry for the load they carried. "Soon," he vowed. "But first we need to help these people understand what you've shown them. The voices are getting louder, and it's hard to keep them all straight." The truth was finally coming out of 16 years of darkness, but with it came questions that would haunt everyone for the rest of their lives. The community braced itself for revelations that would challenge everything they believed they knew about justice, redemption, and the eternal consequences of earthly actions as the sun reached its zenith over Pine Hollow, casting sharp shadows across the church cemetery and the excavation site behind the building. The excavation of Pine Hollow's church floor took 3 days. Working methodically under Judge Harrison's supervision, Sheriff Mackenzie's team removed the wooden planks and began carefully digging through the packed earth beneath. What they found confirmed the Morrison twins' claims with chilling accuracy. 3 complete skeletons lay buried beneath the sanctuary, their bones indeed mixed with the foundation stones as Rebecca had described. Personal effects found with the remains matched descriptions from missing person reports dating back to 1818 and 1819. A gold ring bearing the initials J.P. belonged to Joshua Patterson, a land surveyor who had disappeared while mapping territorial boundaries. A silver-handled knife was identified as belonging to William Morse, a merchant whose family had searched for him across 3 states. But it was the third set of remains that provided the most disturbing confirmation of the twins' impossible knowledge. Wrapped around the skeleton's neck was a distinctive copper cross that had been described in great detail by the family of Robert Chen, a traveling minister who had vanished while carrying donation money for a new church in Tennessee. The extent of Pine Hollow's crimes became evident as each piece of evidence was meticulously compiled. It had been a planned campaign of murder and robbery that had lasted for years, rather than a single act of desperate violence. On the 4th day, Judge Harrison, whose silver hair appeared to have turned grayer during the investigation, spoke to the community that had been reassembled. "The evidence before this court is overwhelming," he declared. 11 men were murdered along these mountain trails between 1818 and 1820. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry stood before the judge in shackles, their faces displaying the hollow exhaustion of men who had carried unbearable guilt for too long, knowing that they would not live to see freedom again. Their killers used the stolen money to build this settlement, then compounded their crimes by killing the Whitman family to protect their secret. Judge Harrison went on to say that the most unsettling thing about these acts is not their violence, but rather their deliberateness. Neither passion nor desperation drove these men to kill. Pastor Phillips listened to the judge's words with a growing sense of spiritual crisis. They developed a methodical way to identify and kill travelers, then use the money from their victims to construct what they claimed was a godly community. The church, the community, and the common faith that united them had all been established on the foundation of innocent blood. How could he continue to serve in a place that had been so thoroughly corrupted by evil? The most profound understanding of the spiritual ramifications of Pine Hollow's misdeeds, however, came from the Morrison twins. "Judge Harrison," Rebecca began, her voice clear enough to be heard clearly in the crowded chapel, "may we speak about forgiveness?" The judge looked down at the 9-year-old girl with a mixture of amazement and respect. After 3 days of witnessing her impossible knowledge proved accurate in every detail, he had learned to listen carefully to anything she said. "Of course, child. What are you hoping to say?" At the front of the church, under the wooden cross that had overseen 16 years of group deception, Rebecca and Rachel made the decision to stand together. "The Whitman sisters want everyone to know that they forgive the men who killed them," Rebecca said. "They understand that fear makes people do terrible things," Rachel added, as she so frequently did. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." Judge Harrison gave a grave nod, saying, "The court concurs with that assessment. The men who committed these crimes must face earthly justice, and the community must find a way to make things right with the families of the victims. Marcus Perry, Samuel Bradford, and Elder Thompson will all go on trial for several robbery and murder charges. However, what about the actual community? What about the structures and church that were built using stolen funds?" With a thoughtful expression on his face, Ezekiel Morrison responded, "Your Honor, we see in Scripture that the sins of the fathers need not be inflicted upon the offspring." For the first time since the investigation started, Pastor Phillips found his voice. "The church building itself must be consecrated anew," he said firmly. "We'll remove and properly bury the remains found beneath the floor. This community can be redeemed if the children choose righteousness over convenience, but only through confession, restitution, and genuine repentance. To make sure these acts are never forgotten, we'll locate the victims' families, provide them with the best compensation we can, and erect a memorial. The Marcus Webb estate alone is entitled to significant restitution," said Solicitor Brennan, who had been taking notes on everything for his legal records. "The money is gone," Elder Thompson said quietly, despite his shackles and deteriorating health. "Spent over the years on community improvements, individual family needs, church maintenance. His brother has authorized me to pursue full recovery of the stolen funds, plus damages for 16 years of family anguish. Then the community itself bears responsibility," Judge Harrison said, adding that the structures built with stolen funds would be sold. "We have nothing left to give." The victims' families received a portion of the money as compensation. Pine Hollow will essentially stop being a community. Judge Harrison, Rebecca Morrison said, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible at her age, "There's something else you need to know about Pine Hollow." The implications of the judge's decision hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Families who had spent 16 years building lives in Pine Hollow would lose their homes, their church, and their entire community structure. Children would be uprooted, elderly residents would be displaced, and a generation of stability would be destroyed by the crimes of their leaders. Except for the distant roar of an impending storm and the sound of wind blowing through the loose planks, the church was silent. "What do you mean, child?" Rachel moved closer to stand next to her sister as Judge Harrison asked, his tone indicating that he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The mine shaft where some of the victims were thrown? It's more than just a location where past atrocities were concealed. Are you implying that these killings have persisted?" Sheriff Mackenzie straightened in his chair. "People are still going missing along these mountain trails. Not the same people," Rebecca explained, adding that the majority of the original murderers had grown too elderly. Others, however, took note of their example and learnt the locations, procedures, and evidence disposal methods. Knowledge like that doesn't die with its creators. If the twins were right, Pine Hollow's crimes had spawned a tradition of violence that had continued for decades, claiming more victims whose disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers. The implications of her statement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. With a grim expression of resolve, Judge Harrison got up from his chair and said, "Sheriff Mackenzie, we'll need to expand our investigation immediately." Ezekiel Morrison gathered his daughters close, his weathered face displaying deep relief mixed with concern for what lay ahead. "If there are more recent crimes connected to this location, we must uncover them all." As the legal proceedings continued around them, the Morrison twins stood quietly together, their impossible burden finally lifted after 3 days of revelation and testimony. They had been voices for the dead, conduits for justice denied, and instruments of truth that could no longer be suppressed. "The voices are quieter now," she said softly. "Faith and hope can rest." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "But there will be other places." Rebecca took one last look around the church, her blue eyes taking in the wooden walls, the simple cross, and the faces of people whose lives had been forever changed by her testimony. Other voices. "Why must we bear all this sorrow, Papa?" With eyes full of unshed tears, Ezekiel stooped down to his daughter's level and said, "I don't know, tiny ones. But I think God only grants particular responsibilities to those who are strong enough to bear them. Whatever your gift is, it might have a greater purpose than any of us can comprehend." The twins were walking hand in hand toward their father's side, and Pastor Phillips had to make the most difficult decision of his ministry. Should he stay and help rebuild what could be salvaged from the community's ruins, or should he flee from a place so thoroughly tainted by violence and deception? If 2 9-year-old children could bear the weight of such devastating truth with grace and forgiveness, perhaps there was hope for redemption, even in the darkest places. The Morrison family was getting ready to leave Pine Hollow, taking their terrible knowledge and mysterious abilities with them. With the knowledge that their entire foundation had been built on innocent blood, the residents of Pine Hollow had moved to other settlements across Kentucky and Tennessee, leaving behind a ghost town 3 weeks later. However, a new story began to spread in churches throughout the region. The story of 2 young girls who had knowledge that defied rational explanation, who acted as voices for the dead and instruments of long-delayed justice. Some people dismissed the story as frontier superstition, while others welcomed it as proof of divine intervention in human affairs. Judge Harrison's final report on the Pine Hollow investigation filled 47 pages and documented crimes spanning more than 2 decades. His concluding paragraph would be quoted in legal texts for generations to come. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the grave. The Morrison family continued their circuit through the isolated churches of Appalachia, and reports continued to follow them. Communities experiencing spiritual renewal, long-buried secrets coming to light, Mysteries solved through impossible knowledge possessed by twin girls who spoke with the authority of prophets despite their young age. The accuracy of the Morrison children's testimony cannot be questioned, even though science is unable to explain where their knowledge came from. It's possible that some facts are simply too significant to be permanently concealed. He never forgot the 3 days in Pine Hollow when 2 9-year-old girls had ripped apart 16 years of meticulously crafted lies with knowledge that no living person should have had. Pastor Phillips went on to found a new ministry in eastern Tennessee, where he spent the rest of his career assisting communities in facing hard truths and seeking true redemption. What is undeniable is the historical record of their accuracy. Every detail they disclosed about Pine Hollow's crimes turned out to be true. Every place they identified produced the evidence they said would be found. Every secret they exposed was confirmed by independent investigation. The mystery of Rebecca and Rachel Morrison's abilities was never solved. Medical experts of the time had no framework for understanding their impossible knowledge, and religious authorities were split on whether their gifts represented divine blessing or something far more complex. The most disturbing part of their story, however, may not be what they disclosed about the past, but rather what they implied about the nature of justice in general. If the dead can't really rest while their murders go unpunished, if innocence has the ability to rise above death and demand accountability, then perhaps our conception of moral consequence transcends the confines of this world. Some say the Morrison twins continued their father's ministry until their own deaths, serving as truth-bearers in communities across the American frontier. Others think they eventually learned to repress their terrible gift and led quiet, normal lives, far from the circuit churches where their reputation had been established. But in the isolated corners of Appalachia, in settlements where ancient crimes remain unpunished and old secrets still fester, travelers occasionally report encountering twin sisters who possess knowledge no living person should have. They speak casually of the dead with familiarity. They uncover truths that have been buried for generations. They remind the guilty that some forms of justice are beyond the bounds of mortal law. The Morrison twins disappeared from historical records sometime in the 1842, their fate as mysterious as their abilities. We know with certainty that truth, like energy, cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one state to another, and sometimes, just sometimes, it finds voices willing to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Whether these encounters are a reflection of the same Morrison twins, their spiritual legacy, or something else entirely, is a mystery that neither science nor faith can fully explain. But the deeper mystery, how 2 9-year-old children could have impossible knowledge and be voices for the dead, remains as unsolved today as it was in 1834. Some truths, it seems, are destined to remain beyond the reach of human understanding, dwelling in that shadowland between faith and reason, where the most profound mysteries of existence continue to elude our grasp. The Pine Hollow investigation files are still in the Kentucky State Archives, accessible to researchers who wish to confirm the extraordinary claims made in this account. Judge Harrison's painstaking documentation, Sheriff Mackenzie's evidence reports, and Pastor Phillips' personal journals all support the case's essential facts. Do you think the Morrison twins actually spoke with the spirits of murder victims? Do you think their knowledge could be explained by natural means we just don't understand? The evidence supports their accuracy, but the source of their abilities is still one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in history. What do you think about the Morrison twins? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think there's a reasonable explanation for their impossible knowledge? Or are you brave enough to consider the possibility that death is not the end of consciousness? Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about reality.